In video 2B, we're going to be discussing basics of the coordinate plane and the midpoint formula. So you should know how to plot a point, but we're going to revisit a few things. One is the quadrants. Quad means 4, so our coordinate plane, which is divided by the y-axis, so go put that on there, and the x-axis, is divided into 4 quadrants that start in the top right and move counterclockwise from quadrant to quadrant. So we have quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. All points in quadrant 1 are positive x and positive y. They are to the right and up. All points in quadrant 2 have a negative x because they're to the left, but they're going up. So a negative and then a positive. All points in quadrant 3 are to the left, and again, I start at what we call the origin at the center, and I go to the left and down to find a point in quadrant 3. In quadrant 4, when I start at the origin, I go to the right and down. So if I threw a few points up here and asked you for the coordinates, here's the first one. I would say that was -5, -2, and that's what point A would be. If I asked you to plot a point B at 7, -3, we start at the origin. 7 is positive, we go to the right. 3 is negative, we go down. And point B is located right here. And you wouldn't put these necessarily on there. And that's all I'm going to say about the coordinate plane. Sometimes that's also called the Cartesian plane. The midpoint formula tells us how to get in the middle of 2 points plotted in the coordinate system. And to get in the middle of any 2 numbers, you average them. So if it's obvious, like what is in the middle of 6 and 8, we say 7. But if I say what's in the middle of 6.12 and 8.37, it's not so obvious and we need a formula. And the formula says you add them and divide by 2, or average them out, and that will send you always to the middle. So obviously, if you can see the middle, you don't need the midpoint formula. The midpoint formula in the coordinate system is used when you have 2 points, and we call them x sub 1. That just means the first x value and the first y value. And then you have another one that we call the second x value and the second y value. To get in the middle of those, you can try to eyeball it, but the formula says that your midpoint can be found by getting between the x's. To do that, we average them. We add them up, and we divide by 2. Then to get in the middle of the y's, we do the same thing. We add up whatever numbers are in the y slots, and we divide them by 2. And that will always get us in the middle. So let's go take a look at a graphical, a numerical, and an ugly numerical. I am looking for the midpoint of this line segment. If you tried to eyeball it, you'd say, it's somewhere in here, but let's go find out exactly where it is. To do that, I'm going to write down the coordinates of these 2 points. This one is 3 to the left and 1 up. This one is 1 to the right and 4 down. When I consult my midpoint formula that's up in this box, it says to get in the middle, I grab my x's and I add them. And then I divide by 2. I'm really averaging the x's and averaging the y's. For the y's, I'm also going to get in the middle of 1 and -4. If I know it with common sense, super. If not, I add them and divide by 2. So when I'm done, I end up with having a midpoint at -2 divided by 2, which is -1, which looks good on my graph. I'd be 1 to the left. And my y-coordinate is what I get when I average the y values. So a 1 plus a negative 4 is negative 3. Dividing it by 2 gives me negative 3 halves, or equivalently, negative 1.5. And let's go back and consult our picture. Does that look good? It looks really good, right? Looks like I'm 1 to the left and 1.5 down. Now, if you're using your calculator because you struggle with negative numbers, which is just fine by me, if you want to use a calculator, go ahead. But if you're going to enter on your calculator for this formula, be careful how you enter it, because on your calculator, let's suppose, I'm going to go purple here, let's suppose you wanted to get in the middle of, say, a negative 11 and a 42. And so on your calculator, let me erase some of this. You remember me saying, okay, you add them up and divide by 2. If on your calculator you just go negative 11 plus 42 and then you hit your divide by 2, it's only going to divide this. So you have two options. Sorry, there was an announcement. Anyway, so you have two options for that. You don't want to have it only divide the 42. So you can either put that top in parentheses on your calculator, or you can hit enter and then divide by 2. So be careful with how you use your calculator for those. So next up, and the last thing in this video, this is a nice short one. I like it when they're nice and short. How do we find the other endpoint when we know the middle? Well, that seems kind of tricky, and you could use a formula, but I'm going to say this is best combated with common sense. Let's suppose that you know that one endpoint is at 5, 2. I'm going to even make this more common sense for just a second. Suppose you're driving and you know that you went 7 miles north and you are halfway. Well, that means to get to the other end, you'd go 7 more miles, right? So if you know the middle and one endpoint, to get to the other endpoint, you just continue that same movement, because if this is in the middle, then I'll just keep going to get to the other spot. That can work with this scenario too. If you know that one of the endpoints is 5, 2, I would suggest you write it down. And if you know the midpoint, and I'm going to call it M, I would write that lined up right below it, and consult these notes when you do your worksheet, because this is much easier than using the formula for this scenario. So what I want to do is figure out, well, what's the other endpoint? So I know I've got, let's call this endpoint A, it doesn't matter. Suppose I'm looking for B, and I know that M is in the middle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk to the middle, just like I did here. I'm going to walk to the middle, and I'm going to keep on walking to the other endpoint. So for me to get from 5 to negative 10, which is in the middle, I had to drop 15. So I dropped 15 and I got to the middle, which means I need to drop 15 more to get to the other endpoint. So what I'm going to do is just continue that motion. I'm going to go down 15, lands me to the middle, down 15 more, and it'll land me to the other endpoint. So if you look at that, I've just walked myself to the other endpoint. Same here. To go from 2 to negative 2, I need to drop 4. You might want to write minus 4. I'm going to drop 4 more to take me to the other end, and that would give me negative 6. Now let's check this out, and let's see if this shortcut really works. And I don't really call it a shortcut, I call it a smart cut, because it really gets you to the answer faster and smoother than any formula would. But let's see if we did it right. And again, you don't have to write this down. I'm just going to check. Let's suppose that I was given both endpoints and there wasn't a twist to this problem. And they just asked me for the middle. So let's suppose I'm looking to see what was the middle. Let's see if it checks out and gives me a negative 10 and a negative 2. To get in the middle, remember, I add the x's. So I go 5 plus negative 25 which is negative 20. I divide it by 2, and I get negative 10. So notice it did walk me to the correct endpoint. Likewise for the y's. I add the y's. 2 plus negative 6 is negative 4, and I divide by 2. And again, that should be negative 10, negative 2, and it is. So I'm going to repeat that process one more time because you're going to get to the worksheet, and this is one thing kids struggle with in this section. So one last time, I'm going to make a fake one. Suppose you know that one endpoint, let's suppose it's point P, let's suppose it's at 1, negative 3, and you know the midpoint of a segment, and maybe that's at 3, negative 4. All right? And they say, what's the other endpoint? Maybe they call it Q. And you're like, oh, what's the other endpoint? Again, here's your process. You walk yourself to the middle, which would be forward 2, and you keep on walking to get to the other end. So the other endpoint must have been at 5, and you can see that 3 is in the middle of 1 and 5, so it does check out. Same here. I go 1 back to get to negative 4. So I'm going to go 1 back to get to negative 5, and that will give me my other endpoint. So you can stop right here and go work on worksheets 2.3 and 2.4. Have a good one. Good night.